Hello and welcome to Popular Antiquarian, the podcast about a middle-aged man trawling through the weird and forgotten corners of pop culture. That middle-aged man is me, HJDoom, and this is the third episode of our ongoing mission to critically assess the output of the Asylum, often lambasted as the world's worst film production company. Though known in large part for their mockbusters, there's never been a low-budget bandwagon that the Asylum wasn't also happy to jump onto if the opportunity presented itself. And in the early 2000s, one of the biggest bandwagons going was zombie movies. So this episode we're looking at Death Valley, The Revenge of Bloody Bill, a zombie western hybrid that also occupies an important place in the history of the Asylum, being the first movie that was produced in-house. We've already seen that they experimented with low-budget slasher movies in their early days with Scarecrow, and I think if they hadn't seen surprise success with War of the Worlds, they might have ended up being just one of many studios churning out cheap horror movies to clog up the shelves of blockbusters, and subsequently padding out the libraries of streaming services. Death Valley, like Scarecrow before it, might have ended up being the template for their business model, and original horror is still something they've returned to from time to time, though generally they've preferred to ape more high-profile horror releases. Calling Death Valley The Revenge of Bloody Bill an original horror movie feels a bit disingenuous, because if there's one subgenre of horror that was everywhere in the early 2000s, it was the zombie movie. Though the modern zombie movie was kick-started by Night of the Living Dead in 1968 and had proved to be a vibrant subgenre by the middle 80s, it started to gather a serious head of steam in the 21st century, with 28 Days Later and Resident Evil giving the zombie movie new energy. 2004 would prove to be something of a watershed moment as Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead remake and Edgar Wright's Shaun of the Dead pushed the zombie film into new prominence. It's this rising tide of undead cannibalism that Death Valley is surfing. Zombie saturation was of course finally achieved in 2010 when AMC bravely decided to produce a TV series based on the Walking Dead comics, which would finally answer the question, what is the absolute maximum amount of zombie-based entertainment the human race is prepared to tolerate? Personally, I have a complicated history with zombie media. If you had asked me in the late 90s what the single greatest art form in the history of humanity was, I would have answered the zombie movie without a moment's hesitation. I loved zombie movies. I watched George A. Romero's original Living Dead trilogy repeatedly, and seeing The Evil Dead 2 and Return of the Living Dead 3 in the middle 90s on grainy VHS remains some of my most formative horror memories. I got badly obsessed with the work of Lucio Fulci, thanks to cheap DVD releases of his best films that were in HMV. I can't entirely explain why I found the idea of near-mindless animated corpses eating people to be the apogee of human creativity, but I did. If you had told me that zombies would one day saturate popular media to the extent that I'd barely be able to tolerate the idea, I'd have called you a fool and argued that the complete saturation of all media with zombies was simply the natural endpoint of Western civilization. Homer, Virgil, Shakespeare, Milton, and the rest were all simply laying the groundwork for 7 different Walking Dead series. Nowadays I'm older and wiser and consider zombie movies to be at best the 3rd or 4th most important art form in human history. More important than poetry or music for sure, but maybe less important than video games with Mario in, or books where the cover is a nearly naked guy with a sword. Nonetheless, you can see the appeal of the genre for the Asylum in 2004. Zombie movies have always been cheap to produce. While good quality prosthetics have always elevated things, you can also go a long way with a few lumps and bumps and some green paint. Since 28 Days Later popularised the high-speed variant, you don't even need to hire actors who can shuffle convincingly. Zombies are cheap, they're scary, they've got a nice simple motivation, and you can structure things like an 80s slasher movie quite easily. All of this is like catnip to a low-budget production company. So we get Death Valley, The Revenge of Bloody Bill, which manages to strip back the budget still further by having all the action take place in a deserted ghost town aka two easily available movie ranches that have been widely used in film and TV. Setting the action in the barely populated backwoods of America has been a popular cost-cutting approach since the days of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Take a small and young cast out into the middle of nowhere and start whittling them down one obnoxious teenager at a time, and then the money will start rolling in. That's the premise, but how does it actually pan out? Honestly, annoyingly well. I was by no means an Asylum virgin when I conceived this stupid project, and in my head it would be something of an endurance test. These films have a poor reputation, which I think is often well deserved. I was determined to subject their films to rigorous critical analysis because I firmly believe that all art deserves to be taken seriously, but I was anticipating a fairly rough time with the actual process of watching an Asylum movie every week until I lose my mind. So far we've had Scarecrow, which is clearly a bad movie, but in a way I found curiously endearing, and War of the Worlds, which was much more interesting than I was expecting. Now we come to Death Valley, The Revenge of Bloody Bill, and I genuinely had a good time with it. I'm starting to feel like the Asylum's reputation as vendors of cinematic manure may be slightly overdone. This is not an important or original piece of filmmaking, but it's a perfectly entertaining way to kill 90 minutes. I've seen far worse at far higher budgets, and even the rubbish bits more evoked smiles than a growing sense of despair. Let's do a quick plot outline. We open with a moderately thrilling car chase in which a drug courier is trying to outrun a police officer in the desert. He escapes, but then crashes the car and is forced on foot to a small town called Sunset Valley. He goes to buy a drink in the saloon, as well you might, and it turns out that the other patrons are zombies who promptly murder him. Cue titles, which are gloriously 2004, all scratchy, flashing effects and filters and music that sounds like someone was trying to rip off Rammstein via 1980s advertising jingles. The chorus is just the words, "Bill will kill," over and over again. It's very bad, but also very funny. Once we're done with the opening, we can then get to the meat of the plot, which is finding a way to get a college debate team to Sunset Valley so that zombies can try and eat them. This is accomplished by having their van held up by a drug dealer trying to find his colleague, who he correctly believes has run off with his drugs and money. That gets everyone into Sunset Valley, where it quickly becomes apparent that strange things are afoot, not least that the town appears to be trapped in a permanent late afternoon, and every attempt to leave puts you right back where you started from. Zombies begin doing their thing, the Stockholm Syndrome kicks in as the teens are forced into an uneasy alliance with the guy who took them captive, and who did at least bring a big bag of guns with him. That's not an exaggeration either, he's got a big bag and it turns out to be full of guns. Kids are dispatched in a fairly random order, and we get to do the fun cliche where one of them gets bitten and starts turning into a zombie. It transpires that the story behind this weirdness is that a Confederate soldier nicknamed Bloody Bill was extrajudicially executed by the good people of Sunset Valley when he came back for revenge after they hung his sister in revenge for some atrocities he committed during his days in the army. Bill came back from the dead, having made a deal with the devil, and begins turning the folk of Sunset Valley into zombies. 2 wrongs don't make a right, and 5 wrongs is absolutely not making anything better. Bill curses the town to eternal sunset, which is convenient for the filmmakers, since it lets them smear a yellow and orange filter over every single shot, which must have made editing a breeze. Eventually, after a perfectly acceptable amount of carnage, the final girl defeats Bill and his army of zombies by pretending to be his sister, which involves her having to do a southern accent, which might have been something they should have checked for when they were casting the lead for the film, but apparently wasn't, because it's rubbish. Roll end credits. Now, there's a couple of things that help this film bounce along quite nicely. The first is that while the cast aren't going to be winning any acting awards, they also aren't terrible, and the characters are likeable, at least by the standards of horror teens. That's not the same thing as being actually likeable, but it's better than you often get. Part of that is the fun conceit that these aren't jocks and prom queens. These are debate nerds. Okay, they are unfathomably good looking by the standards of debate nerds, but The core protagonist, Gwen, gets to be endearingly pedantic and logical a couple of times, which makes her character seem much less off the peg than usual. The guy playing the drug dealer, Earl, Gregory Bastian, manages to infuse his bad boy stereotype with enough charisma that his switch from bad guy to good guy doesn't feel forced. Even the obligatory goofball is mostly a somewhat charming goofball, rather than the kind of sociopathic practical joker you usually get in these things. I found the ensemble, which also includes prolific supporting player Denise Boot, to be significantly less grating than I was expecting. The second element working in the film's favour is the choice to mash up a classic zombie movie with a supernatural slasher. Bloody Bill isn't in it all that much, but he provides the plot with a clear central threat which underpins everything else that's going on. It's only by defeating Bill that the protagonists will be able to escape their fate, and that sense of a clear opponent and a clear win condition deals with one of the biggest obstacles facing cheap zombie movies, a lack of forward momentum in the plot. His supernatural powers also mean that the film can have the zombies appear when they're needed without it feeling too bizarre. It provides a natural way of getting to a reasonable climax, and borrowing from both the zombie movie and the slasher helps focus on the positive points of both genres and paper over some of their problems. Lastly, the film is just fun. It's got a slightly silly vibe, but the actors are all doing their best to play it straight. There is a lovely running motif where each time someone dies, the sign showing the population of Sunset Valley increases rather than decreases, because it is obviously populated only by the dead. The gore effects are simple, but they've spent what little money there is wisely. There's some pretty good practical makeup, especially when one of the cast has been bitten and is on his way to turning into a zombie. Sure, the zombies can run, which always annoys me a bit, but honestly, running zombies are something I've kind of come round to, because they are easier to shoot in a way that's exciting, and probably more low-budget zombie movies should get their murderous cadavers some running shoes. The film also has some ripe old dialogue with lines like, "Once you smell death, you never mistake it for anything else." And a massive chunk of exposition to get us the backstory, which has been properly crowbarred in there, probably at the last minute. It's also nice to see both the black actors in the cast go deep into the runtime, which wasn't always a thing in 2004. Bloody Bill himself is also pleasantly rubbish as an antagonist, having, as he does, the sort of nickname you give to an electrician who's always running late. He looks like he's just come home from a big night at a real ale festival, and ultimately he's defeated by a woman putting on an ersatz southern accent. He's also kind of charmingly simple in his goals and motivations. He's got his little town of zombies, and that seems to be enough for him. And honestly, I love that. Director Byron Werner is better known as a cinematographer than a director. He's done a lot of work in music videos, and he combined that with horror in 2019 by working on a Coldplay video. He clearly knows which way to point a camera, and there's a certain dynamism to his shots that help elevate the action sequences slightly above the bargain basement level I was anticipating. He does a decent, if unremarkable, job, and it's hard to notice the errors when there's this massive yellow and orange filter over everything, including most of the internal shots. I don't want to suggest that this is some sort of forgotten gem. There's plenty about this movie that is deeply bad. The soundtrack is hideous. The zombie makeup varies wildly in how convincing it looks. There's also not really enough of them to be a proper zombie horde. It's more of a zombie huddle. Buck the goofball may be less aggravating than many similar goofball characters, but he still ultimately feels like he ran in from a panto that was in town. I might be pleased that there isn't a genuinely concerning sex nuisance on the character list, but the absence of a borderline criminal pervert probably shouldn't be a badge of quality, even though it actually is with low-budget horror movies. When all is said and done, this is still a wildly cheap production that was visibly knocked together as quickly as humanly possible in search of some of that sweet zombie dollar. But I still quite liked it. So in summary, that is Death Valley, The Revenge of Bloody Bill, a fairly unremarkable cheap production that's carried along on a mixture of enthusiasm and just enough wit and flair to make it more likeable than I was expecting. I really think the secret sauce is the way it borrows from different subgenres to create something that feels less hackneyed, despite almost everything in it being ripped off from somewhere else, and there's a good lesson in that. Originality is mostly the art of stealing from enough different places that it seems original. If you like a weird zombie movie with a few low-key magical overtones, and as a Fulci fan I definitely do, you could do a lot worse. Also, a lot of the most irritating elements of early 2000s B-movie productions have aged into a faint glow of nostalgia for me. It is a period with a strong visual look, for better or for worse. So I would say this is actually somewhat worth checking out. So 3 films down, and I'm still being moderately entertained. Is this the best the Asylum can do? I was promised absolute garbage, and this is nothing. This has been pleasant. I've had a good time. Is that what you want, Asylum? Pleasant? Me having a good time? Well, we're going to put that to the test with the next episode, because we're heading back into the murky waters of the mockbuster and looking at a film that's a rip-off of a film that was a dispiriting exercise in overblown hype and an early example of what can go wrong when the internet is allowed to influence the way movies are made. You've probably already forgotten snakes on a plane was a thing, but who could be ready for snakes on a train? This is potentially the most redundant movie ever made, and I hope you will join me for that. In the meantime, you can contact me by email at HJDoomRetroFun, all one word, at gmail.com, or by following me on Blue Sky at HJDoom. If you want to force me to carry on doing this sort of thing out of guilt, you can give me money to do so over at patreon.com/HJDoom, where every penny is greatly appreciated because I am extremely poor. I have another podcast called Fantastic Fights, where I play adventure game books and explore them in unnecessary detail, which you can listen to if you like. Thank you very much for listening to this. Take care, and I'll see you soon.